Imagine a man not yet 30 who could burn through hundreds of thousands of dollars in a single night chartering a jet so his friends could toast New Year's Eve in Sydney. Then race the clock to do the countdown again in Las Vegas.
I got a friend, he got some money. And he flew me, Leonardo DiCaprio, Jonah Hill, and some other cats, and we flew to Australia, right? And we did the countdown in Australia. Get out, Mike, how are you, Mike? Jamie, get out, Mike? So we did the countdown in Australia, then jumped back on a plane, and then did the countdown in Vegas. That's crazy.
So he had.
Yeah.
That's how famous he is. He had
Yeah.
2 New Year's Eve.
Yeah,
That's how
that's
successful you are
crazy.
now.
That was
2
nuts.
New Year's Eve.
Yeah.
That's incredible.
But when I got to Vegas, for some reason, they wouldn't let me in the club. It was crazy.
Leonardo DiCaprio became very close to Joe Low.
You know, in the credits of Wolf of Wall Street, at the very end, there's a note. Special thanks, Joe Low.
That was Joe Low, the man behind the glitter, the deep-pocketed host who bankrolled some of the most extravagant parties in the world, where you could spot Leonardo DiCaprio raising a glass, Jamie Foxx on the mic, Britney Spears popping out of a giant birthday cake, and Paris Hilton dancing under the lights. How did a soft-spoken Malaysian dealmaker in his 20s manage to live like a Gulf prince funding the Wolf of Wall Street? The answer would expose a $4.5 billion hole in his country's development fund and unravel one of the most audacious financial heists of the century. This is the story of how Joe Low turned public wealth into his private playground, and how the world finally began to follow the money. To understand how Joe Low ended up moving billions across borders and dazzling Hollywood, you have to start far from the champagne yachts on a humid island off Malaysia's northwest coast. He was born Low Taik Joe in 1981 in Georgetown, Penang, into a family that was comfortably wealthy by local standards. His father, Larry Low, ran a successful garment trading and investment business, enough to afford private schools and a modern house on the island's leafy streets. But the Lows were hardly part of Asia's dynastic old money elite. Malaysia in the late 1980s and 90s was a country on the rise oil and gas discoveries, glittering new highways, the Petronas Towers piercing the skyline of Kuala Lumpur. Beneath that boom. However, politics often revolved less around formal rules and more around who you knew, an atmosphere that quietly shaped the boys' early sense of how power really worked. Joe Low's rise didn't begin with champagne yachts or Hollywood premieres. It began in a school uniform thousands of miles from home. What began as jokes and skits slowly turned into something sharper, a hunger to be seen, to be more. At 18, he had his first line on stage, a single sentence in the musical Martin Guerre. One line, one chance, and he made it count. From there came years of bit parts in TV comedies and background roles in films like All or Nothing. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was honest, the slow climb of someone who believed that persistence could bend destiny. Friends from those years still tell the story of a summer when Joe borrowed a 160-foot yacht from a family friend, quietly swapped out the framed photos on board for pictures of himself, and played host as if the boat were his. On another night, he reportedly drafted a fake letter on Brunei Embassy stationery just to secure a VIP table at one of London's trendiest clubs. The ruse worked and the lesson stuck if you look the part. Doors will open. When he crossed the Atlantic to attend the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, Joe only refined the persona he had begun crafting in London. He leased a sleek Lexus convertible, let rumors swirl that he was a Malaysian prince, and cultivated a reputation as a savvy stock picker by publishing columns in the campus paper columns that classmates later suspected were lifted straight from professional Wall Street reports. But the real play was happening off campus. Joe made it a point to befriend the wealthiest students at Wharton heirs to Gulf sovereign wealth fortunes, Hong Kong property scions, and the future gatekeepers of finance and tech, to impress them. He threw lavish-looking birthday parties, sometimes renting out entire clubs. Often he would put down only a token deposit and bargain down the final bill afterward, a quiet trick that kept the illusion of limitless wealth alive. By the time he graduated, he'd mastered the art of building access before building fortune, instead of returning straight home. He embarked on what he called a networking tour across the Middle East, meeting with influential families and even officials who oversaw Abu Dhabi's powerful sovereign wealth funds. Those early introductions, made over banquets and yacht decks rather than in boardrooms, would later become the scaffolding for one of the world's most audacious financial scandals. By the time Joe Low returned to Asia in the mid-2000s, he was no longer the shy boy from Penang. He had become a polished networker, fluent in the unspoken language of global deal-making. The next chapter of his rise would play out not in classrooms or nightclubs, but in boardrooms, hotel lobbies, and the discreet corners of political offices, places where a well-timed introduction could unlock doors that money alone never could. At first, his ventures looked almost ordinary. He dabbled in boutique investment funds, brokered introductions between Middle Eastern oil wealth and Southeast Asian real estate projects, even snapped up trophy apartments in New York and Hong Kong. Yet, there was always a touch of theater about his choices. Each purchase felt less like a personal indulgence and more like a carefully chosen prop, a $30 million Beverly Hills mansion, a private jet waiting for weekend parties, a growing collection of blue chip art. These weren't mere luxuries, they were signals to princes and billionaires that he belonged in their league. The real breakthrough came in 2009 as Malaysia's deputy prime minister, Najib Razak, prepared to take the top office and needed a signature initiative to prove he could transform the country's fortunes. Jolo, just 27, saw his chance. Inspired by what he'd observed in the Gulf states, he proposed creating a Malaysian sovereign wealth fund, a state-backed investment vehicle that could channel billions of foreign capital into energy, infrastructure, and tourism, branded One Malaysia Development Berhad, or 1MDB. The fund was marketed as a bold engine for green energy projects and new jobs. On paper, Jolo was merely an informal advisor. In practice, he was the invisible architect of the fund's early moves, choosing its partners, guiding capital into ventures he quietly controlled, and persuading Najib that 1MDB needed flexibility rather than heavy oversight. That so-called flexibility became the loophole through which billions would later disappear. His first major coup was a much-publicized joint venture with Petro-Saudi International, announced as a billion-dollar oil exploration partnership. It later emerged that only about $300 million actually reached the project. The remaining $700 million was wired to a Seychelles-registered shell company called Good Star Limited, secretly controlled by Joe Low. It was a breathtaking move, siphoning away nearly three-quarters of the fund's very first deal, camouflaged beneath layers of legitimate-looking paperwork. Flush with success, he widened his stage to include Hollywood through his new production company, Red Granite Pictures. Jolo helped finance Martin Scorsese's The Wolf of Wall Street with an estimated $100 million, a deliciously ironic choice that would later become shorthand for his own high-rolling escapades. He bought a stake in EMI Music Publishing, mingled with pop stars, and turned his parties into showcases where celebrity and capital collided. Britney Spears bursting out of a birthday cake in Las Vegas, Leonardo DiCaprio thanking him by name at the Golden Globes. Behind the glitter, he was weaving even more intricate financial channels. Offshore shell companies sprouted in the British Virgin Islands and the Seychelles, some structured with bearer shares that concealed their true owners, to raise still more capital. He struck a deal with Goldman Sachs, which in 2012-2013 helped 1MDB issue $6.5 billion in bonds in arrangement that brought the bank an unusually rich $600 million in fees, while about $1.4 billion quietly detoured into accounts under Jolo's control. By then, the young Malaysian fixer had stitched together a globe-spanning empire real estate trophies from Los Angeles to London, equity stakes in music and film, personal ties to Gulf sovereign funds, and unprecedented sway over his home country's flagship development project. Yet the very tactics that built his fortune opacity, spectacle, borrowed power were the same ones setting a slow-burn fuse beneath it. For a few dazzling years, the illusion held. Malaysia's new prime minister had his showcase fund. Wall Street had a lucrative new client. Hollywood had a mysterious patron with a taste for Gatsby-esque parties. Jolo appeared untouchable proof that, in the right hands, access could be alchemized into empire. What few outside his inner circle realized was how fragile that empire truly was, and how quickly it would crumble once the paper trail began to surface. For a time, Jolo looked less like a financier and more like a phantom prime minister, a man with no official title who somehow pulled the strings of politics, banking, and even pop culture all at once. In Kuala Lumpur's corridors of power, he was the quiet architect behind Malaysia's new sovereign wealth fund. In Hollywood, he was the mysterious backer who could wire eight-figure sums overnight. On Wall Street, he was the prized client whose fees were too lucrative to question. But behind the polished smiles and midnight wire transfers, the empire he built was about to test just how far money could bend the rules of government and how violently those rules would snap back. Malaysia's 2009 election season would become the first big test of 1MDB's development mission. Publicly, the fund promised power plants, green energy, and tourism hubs. Privately, it became a political war chest for Najib Razak, who had just stepped up from deputy prime minister to the country's top job. Joe Low, at only 27, had learned to trade favors the way others traded currency, instead of demanding a title. He cultivated Najib's trust as if he were part of the family, quietly paying private school tuition for Najib's daughter, showering his wife Rosma Mansour with multi-million-dollar jewelry, whispering investment ideas that made the prime minister look like a reformer. It worked, according to investigators. That trust gave him extraordinary freedom. Under Joe's urging, 1MDB operated with almost no external oversight, no independent supervisory board. Minimal auditing, all under the banner of flexibility to move fast. On the surface, voters saw a development boom. What they couldn't see was the new informal power block forming behind the curtain. But that was only the beginning of the shell game. The fund's first joint venture with Petro-Saudi had already skimmed $700 million into Jolo's secret Seychelles account. Yet that was just a warm-up. In 2012 and 2013, 1MDB, with the help of Goldman Sachs, raised $6.5 billion on international markets. The bonds were advertised as financing power plants and strategic acquisitions, hidden behind layers of offshore shell companies in the British Virgin Islands, Seychelles, and Switzerland. At least $1.4 billion was siphoned off into accounts Joe controlled. Some of that cash bought Manhattan penthouses, Van Gogh and Monet paintings, a $250 million super yacht, and fueled star-studded parties for Goldman. The deal was a windfall $600 million in fees, nearly 200 times the typical commission for a sovereign bond sale. At the time, no one dared ask too many questions. But every dollar diverted was another crack spreading quietly through the facade, a crack that was about to split wide open. While the money churned through shell companies, Joe Low was crafting a different kind of influence cultural clout. Through Red Granite Pictures, he bankrolled Martin Scorsese's The Wolf of Wall Street, reportedly putting up $100 million. When Leonardo DiCaprio accepted his Golden Globe, he thanked Joe on stage. Tabloids splashed photos of the young Malaysian at Las Vegas birthday bashes where Britney Spears popped out of a cake and Kanye West performed for a private crowd. Supermodel Miranda Kerr received a white Ferrari and millions worth of Hermes Birkin bags. In just 8 months between 2009 and 2010, Joe is said to have burned through $85 million on parties alone, even chartering a jet to celebrate New Year's Eve twice, first in Sydney, then again hours later in Las Vegas. The tabloids called him the Asian Gatsby, often pictured standing apart from his own parties, scanning the room as if measuring the spectacle's effect. But while the champagne flowed, auditors back in Kuala Lumpur were beginning to notice that the numbers didn't quite add up. And perhaps the cruelest twist of all, it didn't end in outrage, but indifference. The laughter stopped not with a bang, but with a sigh. The world simply moved on. Then, in 2015, a whistleblower leaked internal emails and banking documents. The revelations were explosive. The fund was tens of billions of ringgit in debt, and huge tranches of borrowed money had been routed to offshore accounts tied to Joe Low. The leak set off Malaysia's largest street protests in decades. Hundreds of thousands marched in Kuala Lumpur chanting Najib resign. Soon after, the Department of Justice launched what it called the largest kleptocracy case in its history, seizing more than $1 billion in assets, including the superyacht Equanimity and artworks by Monet and Picasso. Najib himself was tried and in 2020 convicted on corruption charges linked to 1MDB. Receiving a 12-year prison sentence, though, as of 2025, he continues to appeal and lives partly under house arrest by royal decree. Joe Low vanished in 2015 and, according to investigative reporters Bradley Hope and Tom Wright, Billion Dollar Whale, has since lived as a fugitive in Shanghai's Green Hills enclave under an alleged fake Australian passport. But even with the main players gone, the aftershocks of the scandal were far from over. By 2025, Malaysia has clawed back roughly $7 billion in assets from various settlements, including $330 million from JP Morgan Chase, $2.5 million in frozen Palantir shares belonging to PetroSaudi's Tariq Obaid, and a fraction of Joe Low's own holdings, yet billions remain missing. Civil society groups argue the affair exposed not just a single fraudster, but a deeper failure in global finance, blue-chip banks, and discreet law firms willing to ignore red flags as long as the clients were profitable. For ordinary Malaysians, the cost was painfully real. Those billions could have built schools, hospitals, and affordable housing. Instead, the country was left with heavier public debt and years of political turmoil. Online, the hashtag #WhereIsJoeLow resurfaces each time a new lead emerges, while digital activists have even floated a $30 million blockchain bounty for information leading to his arrest. More than a decade after that first billion quietly shifted out of 1MDB's accounts, a question still lingers like an open wound. Was Joe Low a lone mastermind who conned an entire nation, or merely the front man for a deeper, unpunished network of global insiders who helped him move the money, whatever the truth? The scandal turned Joe Low's name from a whispered rumor in private equity circles into a global cautionary tale proof that in an interconnected world, a clever young operator could reroute a nation's wealth into his own playground, at least until the paper trail finally caught up. When the protests died down and the courts moved in, Joe Low disappeared from the red carpets as quickly as he had appeared. Today, at 44 years old, he is less the Gatsby-style party impresario and more a fugitive whose exact whereabouts remain a mystery. Malaysian authorities believe he is still abroad, reportedly living under assumed names in Shanghai's gated Green Hills enclave, a leafy compound favored by the Chinese elite. Rumors surface from time to time a blurry photo at a luxury mall, whispers of him showing up at a private Victoria's Secret party in 2023, but nothing confirmed enough to end the global manhunt. The fortune that once seemed limitless has thinned but not vanished. Investigators estimate that even after asset seizures and legal settlements, hundreds of millions of dollars remain unaccounted for, likely hidden in labyrinthine trusts and shell companies. Friends who once described him as Panda, the generous host who liked making sure everyone was having fun, now say he lives in near-constant anxiety, moving discreetly and trusting almost no one. Unlike many scandal-stained tycoons who try to redeem their reputations with philanthropy, Joe Low has made no significant charitable gestures. There are no hospitals bearing his name, no scholarships, no urban renewal grants to offset the billions he helped drain from Malaysia's development coffers. His legacy, for now, is measured less by buildings and more by court filings and seized yachts. That absence of a public-spirited footprint is part of why his story still stirs such anger at home. The billions lost from 1MDB could have built rural clinics, subsidized green energy projects, and funded affordable housing. Instead, they left a generation of Malaysians saddled with debt and a lingering sense of betrayal. Many credit the scandal as a catalyst for the historic 2018 election upset that ended 6 decades of single-party rule, showing that public outrage over corruption could topple even the most entrenched political machine. Yet Joe Lowe's reach left marks beyond politics. In Hollywood, he helped finance an Oscar-nominated Scorsese epic and odd, almost surreal footnote in cinema history. In global finance, his case became a textbook example of how offshore havens, shell structures, and lax banking due diligence can be weaponized to move public wealth into private hands. Compliance courses at banks now cite 1MDB as a cautionary tale. Bond issuance rules in several countries have been tightened because of it. Some analysts argue that, ironically, his most enduring legacy may be the reforms his crimes forced into being. Malaysia has strengthened oversight of state-owned funds, tightened auditing standards, and pursued high-profile recoveries from international banks. The U.S. Department of Justice has expanded its kleptocracy unit, citing 1MDB as proof of the need for cross-border enforcement. Still, the personal story ends on a far quieter note than it began. The man who once threw 8-figure parties and collected Picassos now lives, according to former acquaintances. In self-imposed exile, a wealthy fugitive peering over his shoulder. His saga has become a parable of how dazzling wealth can evaporate into suspicion and solitude. Joe Lowe's name no longer evokes the glamour of Las Vegas champagne towers. It evokes the cost of unchecked ambition and the vulnerability of nations whose resources can be captured by a handful of clever operators. Whether history remembers him as a criminal mastermind, a gifted but reckless dealmaker, or merely a symptom of a broken financial system, his legacy is already etched into Malaysia's political map and into the compliance manuals of banks worldwide, a cautionary legend of an empire built on illusion. A decade ago, Joe Lowe was the life of every party the young man in a tuxedo raising a glass to Hollywood royalty. A phantom billionaire whose money seemed to flow without end. Today, his name lives on in court dockets, asset seizure reports, and online hashtags demanding justice. In a way, that arc tells us as much about the systems that enabled him as it does about the man himself. The 1MDB saga revealed how fragile the guardrails of global finance can be when dazzled by the illusion of limitless wealth. A sovereign wealth fund meant to spark development in Malaysia became a private ATM for a well-connected insider. Major banks that should have been gatekeepers turned into eager enablers. Politicians treated development cash as campaign fuel. The human cost wasn't measured in yacht decks or champagne fountains, but in lost opportunities, schools unbuilt, jobs unfunded, trust in institutions eroded. Yet the scandal also left behind something unexpected, a measure of reform. Malaysia strengthened its auditing of public funds. U.S. and European regulators tightened rules on high-risk bond issuances. Global banks cite the case as a textbook failure they do not want to repeat. In that sense, Joe Lowe's downfall became a warning sign for an entire generation of policymakers. For viewers, the story prompts harder questions. If a single individual, armed mainly with charm, access, and shell companies, could move billions across borders, what does that say about the resilience of the systems we rely on? Is Joe Lowe simply one charismatic outlier or proof that the global financial order is still too easy to game? Those questions linger long after the headlines fade. Do you believe Joe Lowe will ever be caught, we might ask? Or will he remain a ghost of the modern financial age? If state funds continue to lack transparency, what future scandals might already be brewing in the shadows? We invite you to share your thoughts below, not just about the man, but about the system that made his rise possible. And if you want to explore more hidden networks of power and money shaping the modern world, stay tuned for our upcoming deep dives into Najib Razak's political machine and other notorious financial empires.